Adrian. All right, so here's your unit crash course. So in level one, we looked at interdependence of living things. What this is talking about is looking at how organisms within an ecosystem depend on each other and depend on resources and how they compete with each other, how they interact to keep the ecosystem in balance. So we can show energy flow in a few different ways. We can look at a food chain versus a food web. A food chain is just going to be one single path going from a producer up to the different levels of consumers. And then we can look at a food web, which is all of the interwoven food chains, looking at many more possibilities of predator-prey relationships and competition and dependence and things like that. So organisms depend on and compete with each other for biotic and abiotic resources. The biotic resources are going to be the living things. So whether it's something that they eat or trees that they might use as shelter, things like that. And then abiotic is going to be your non-living factors, which would be things like the water, the sunlight, the soil, territory, things like that. So the other way that we can look at energy flow is through an energy pyramid. An energy pyramid is not going to show all the different possible ways that the energy can transfer, but it's really good at showing about how much energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. A trophic level is just one level within the food web that has general types of either producers or consumers. So energy is lost in the form of heat as you move up the energy pyramid, because 90% of what animals are going to consume, they use just to live, and so that 90% eventually is burned off, and so only 10% is still held within the organisms themselves. So at the bottom level, we start out with our producers, because they are going to capture 100% of the energy that we receive from the sun, and they convert that energy into a usable form for all of the other animals in the ecosystem. So the plants, once they get eaten by primary consumers, those animals, typically herbivores, are going to use up 90% of that food energy to live. And so then within all of the organisms in that level for the ecosystem, there is only about 10% of that original sun's energy left. And every time that you go up another energy level, it decreases to be only 10% of that 10. So we get 1%, and then we get 1/10%. This is also why you don't have very many top predators in the ecosystem, and you have many, 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 many more plants and producers in the ecosystem. It all has to do with that energy being used up and then lost to the ecosystem as heat. Now, limiting invasive species or introducing invasive species can impact certain organisms and cause a chain reaction through the ecosystem. So when we look at a food web, we can look at a couple of different things. I can look at what organisms depend on phytoplankton for energy. Well, if I follow the arrows, there's two arrows coming off of phytoplankton. So that means that the zooplankton depend on them, but also the krill. So both of these organisms depend on the phytoplankton to get their energy. Because they depend on the same resource, they're also in competition with each other. This is each of their only food resources. So let's say if the krill population explodes and there's a whole lot more, they're going to be eating more of the phytoplankton, so then there's going to be less food available for the zooplankton. So some of the zooplankton might die off because they're in competition over food. Now over here with the seaweed, the crab depends on the seaweed as a food resource, but it's not in competition with anything else over the seaweed. It's the only thing that eats the seaweed. Same thing with the squid. The squid is going to depend on the crab, but the squid isn't competing with anything else to eat the crab. Now, the competition over the squid, we've got the penguin and the elephant seal. Both of those animals are going to compete over getting enough squid to live on and survive. So when we look at dependence and we look at competition, this is where we need to look at our arrows and look at where is the arrow coming from? And that's going to be a food source that the organism depends on. And if there's more than one arrow branching off of any organism, then where those arrows go, those are going to be the organisms that compete over it. So the other thing we can look at is if something were to happen to an organism in the ecosystem, it could have an impact on everything else in the ecosystem. So let's say the seaweed, there's some kind of pollution in the area and it kills off all of the seaweed. So because the seaweed all dies, and that's the crab's only food source, now all the crab will die. And because the crab is the only food source for the squid, all of the squid are eventually going to die. And then that will continue to go up into the food web until we get to the point of, the penguins no longer have food, the elephant seal no longer has food. So now the killer whale, its only food source is the leopard seal, but the leopard seal is losing one of its food sources. So it's a whole domino effect. And you can follow those different effects by just following the arrows. So then, another thing that we can look at are graphs. Sometimes you'll see a graph showing the population changes between predator-prey relationships. So we're looking at the population of moose. That's going to be this blue line right here. And then the population of wolves is going to be the red line. So if we look here about 1970, in 1970, the wolf population is really, really low. And so because they eat the moose, if there's not a lot of wolves, then that's going to allow the moose population to grow. So the moose population is way up here. But then as the moose population grows, it provides more food for the wolf population. So eventually the wolves are going to be able to eat more and they'll reproduce more. So the wolf population starts to go up, but now as they eat more of the moose population is going to go down. So if we look at how these lines mirror each other, as the prey goes up, then shortly after the predator will catch up. But as the predator catches up, now the prey starts to go down. And once the prey goes down, then the predators are going to lose a lot of their food, so they're going to decrease. And so over a long period of time, this ebb and flow is a balance to the ecosystem. But you can see that in the graph. So then in level 2, I already sent you the video about environmental changes, so you can go back and you can watch all of that, looking at biodiversity and environmental change, ecological succession. And then the last level was about human impact on the environment. So we can look at water quality in our groundwater, in our aquifers, but we can also look at surface water, mainly the oceans. So humans depend on this groundwater for drinking water and the use in agriculture and farming and ranching. We pump water out of the ground to use it, but people can put harmful chemicals and pollute the ground, and eventually all of those toxins are going to seep through the ground. They're going to percolate, and they're going to end up in the groundwater, making it more toxic. So then we have to use more time and more money to clean the water before it can be used again. Some of the other key terms with groundwater, we can look at the unsaturated zone, which is the part of the ground that's still dry. And then once we dig deep enough to get to ground that it's wet, this is our saturated zone because it's full of water. This is our water table, this is our groundwater, this is our aquifer. And we can look at how permeable rocks are. Permeable means how easily water can seep through and flow through the rocks underground. So if we look at the difference between smaller gravel and bigger fractured rock, the fractured rock has bigger and more spaces between it, so it's more permeable than the gravel. If we get to bedrock, bedrock is solid and there's no spaces in it, so it's not going to be permeable at all. And then when we look at how humans impact our surface water can be lakes, rivers, streams, but then also the ocean. So we depend on the ocean for a lot of different things. We get a lot of the air that we breathe, a lot of the oxygen actually comes from the ocean. We use it for transportation with cargo shipping, food, getting a lot of seafood, recreation, doing fun stuff, climate regulation with ocean currents, those convection currents, the economy, people working in the oceans, near the oceans, using the oceans, stuff like that. And then also medicine. We use a lot of the plants and animals that are in the ocean. We use some of their tissues to help with medicines. So those are the ways that we depend on the ocean, and then we can impact it in a few really big ways. Runoff is going to be when rain, or maybe if people are watering their yards or their like crops in their fields. Surface runoff is going to be the water carrying any pollutants or any toxins over the ground, and then they end up in those surface water areas like the rivers and lakes and things like that. So if we have a lot of fertilizer in an agricultural area and it washes down into a lake or into the ocean, fertilizers help plants grow. And on the land, that's a good thing. But in the water, it's not a good thing, because what it's going to do is it's going to cause the algae in the water to overgrow, and it's going to bloom way too much, and then it's going to block too much sunlight from the water, and the fish and other organisms aren't going to be able to get the sunlight that they need and to have the space that they need to swim around. Another negative impact would be overfishing. People go out into the ocean and they fish for a living, but if they take out too many of the fish, then they can affect the ecosystem. So let's say, we take out this particular batch of fish. Well, now we don't have these fish eating the zooplankton and the krill, so both of those populations are going to go up a lot because they don't have as many predators. And so now with more krill and zooplankton, they're going to be eating more of the phytoplankton, so that can harm the producers for that food web in the long run. So overfishing can be really, really damaging to the ocean food webs. But one good thing that people do is build artificial reefs. Artificial reefs are made out of usually metal structures that they sink into an area where there used to be a coral reef that has been damaged. And that metal structure can then encourage the growth of new coral, new producers. It provides a new habitat for the fish and those plants in an area where the coral reef might have been damaged. So artificial reefs is a really good thing. Limiting fishing within the oceans is a good thing. And limiting the amount of runoff, limiting the amount of pesticides and chemicals that people put on the ground to be able to seep into the groundwater or run off into the freshwater. So that's the unit. I hope this was helpful. I know it's a really long video, and I'm sorry. But watch through this. You can watch through the other one that I sent you last week, and then take your quiz. I know you'll do great. But let me know if you need any help with anything else. All right? Bye.